I was told to prove my worth in 1 week. I suspended perks, exposed every test, faced the family tribunal, and left with divorce, assets, and peace. Change everything. I need 1 week to think if you're worth keeping. No context, no explanation, just a cold ultimatum from the woman I'd been married to for 6 years. Most men would panic. Most would call immediately, begging for clarity, promising to change whatever needed changing. But as I read those words a second time, something clicked into place. She wasn't asking for space to work on us. She was giving me an expiration date, like I was some product on a shelf she wasn't sure about purchasing. I set my phone down and finished the report I was working on. 20 minutes later, I picked it up and typed back, "Take all the time you need. I'll be using mine productively. Send." The response came within seconds. "That's it? No questions?" "What's the question? You've made your position clear." 3 dots appeared and disappeared multiple times. She was expecting me to crack, to flood her with messages asking what I'd done wrong, what I could fix, how I could earn my way back into her good graces. Instead, I opened my laptop and started making some overdue changes. First stop, our joint credit cards. I called the bank and explained I needed to remove an authorized user due to separation proceedings. The representative was professional and efficient. Within 10 minutes, her access was suspended. Next, I changed the passwords on our streaming accounts, online shopping profiles, and shared cloud storage. If she wanted to evaluate my worth, she could do it without using my resources. My phone buzzed again. "What did you do to the Netflix? Prioritizing my expenses during your evaluation period. Are you serious right now? Dead serious. You said you need time to think. I'm giving you the full experience of what life looks like without me." The beauty of this approach wasn't revenge, it was clarity. For months, maybe years, I'd been getting the feeling that she saw me as a convenience rather than a partner. The way she'd dismiss my opinions during dinner conversations with friends. How she'd make plans without consulting me, then act annoyed when I had conflicting commitments. The subtle eye rolls when I'd suggest date nights or weekend trips. This text wasn't spontaneous. This was the culmination of someone who'd been taking inventory of their relationship, like a business merger, weighing pros and cons, calculating whether the benefits outweighed the costs. Well, now she could run those calculations with real data. I drove home that evening with a strange sense of calm. The house felt different when I walked in. She was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, clearly waiting for the conversation she thought we needed to have. "We should talk," she said. "About what? About what you did today? Cutting off my cards, changing passwords? That's pretty extreme." I poured myself a glass of water and looked at her directly. "You texted me that you're spending a week deciding if I'm worth keeping. I figured you'd want an accurate assessment. Hard to evaluate someone's value while you're actively using their resources." Her face flushed. "That's not what I meant." "Then you should have been more specific. Communication is important in relationships, or so I've heard." The sarcasm wasn't lost on her. She shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing this wasn't going according to whatever script she'd imagined. "Look, I just think we need to figure out if we're right for each other. Things have been different lately." "Different how?" "You know what I mean." "Actually, I don't. But here's what I know. You sent me a text today treating our marriage like a probationary period. You want to spend a week thinking about my value? Go ahead. But you'll do it with complete honesty. No shared accounts, no joint benefits, no safety net. If you're evaluating whether I'm worth keeping, you need to experience what you'd actually be keeping or losing." She stared at me for a long moment, probably expecting me to soften, to explain that I was just hurt and acting out. Instead, I finished my water and headed upstairs. "Where are you going?" "To use my time productively like I said I would." That night, I researched divorce attorneys in our area not because I'd made any final decisions, but because a man who knows his worth doesn't wait around hoping someone else will recognize it. I bookmarked 3 firms with excellent reputations and made a mental note to call them tomorrow. My phone stayed quiet for the rest of the evening. No apology texts, no attempts to walk back her ultimatum. No recognition that maybe demanding someone prove their worth to you isn't the foundation of a healthy marriage. As I turned off the lights, I realized something important. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not the version of me that had been trying to decode her moods and anticipate her dissatisfactions, but the man who knew what he brought to the table and didn't need anyone's permission to recognize his own value. She wanted a week to think? Fine. But she was about to discover that some evaluations reveal more about the evaluator than the evaluated. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and hit the gym, not because I was stressing or trying to prove anything, but because maintaining my routine was part of maintaining my standards. When you know your worth, you don't let other people's uncertainty derail your consistency. I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of coffee, clearly waiting for me. She looked up expectantly, probably anticipating some kind of morning-after conversation about yesterday's events. "Good workout?" she asked, her tone carrying that false casualness people use when they're fishing for bigger reactions. "Always is." I grabbed a protein shake from the fridge and started making breakfast. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. That's the point, isn't it?" She closed her laptop and turned to face me fully. "I think you're taking this the wrong way. When I said I needed time to think, I meant we should both evaluate where we are. This isn't just about you." I cracked 2 eggs into the pan and kept my back to her. "Interesting. Your text specifically mentioned thinking about whether I'm worth keeping. Nothing about mutual evaluation, nothing about us both reflecting, just you deciding my value. Don't twist my words." "I'm not twisting anything. I'm reading exactly what you wrote." I turned around, leaning against the counter. "But since you're interested in evaluation, let's talk about that. What specifically are you evaluating?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected defensiveness, maybe pleading for specifics so I could address her concerns. Instead, I was treating this like the business transaction she'd presented it as. "Well, we've been growing apart, you have to admit that." "Growing apart? How?" "You're always working late. You don't want to go out with my friends anymore. You've been distant." I nodded thoughtfully. Interesting perspective. The working late part is accurate. I have been putting in extra hours because I got promoted to regional manager 3 months ago. Remember that? The night I came home excited to tell you, and you were upset because it meant I'd miss your book club's wine night. Her face tightened slightly. "As for your friends, you're right again. I did stop wanting to hang out with people who spend entire evenings complaining about their husbands while their husbands aren't there to defend themselves. Call it a personality flaw. That's not fair. Neither is being told I'm distant by someone who spent last weekend at her sister's house without mentioning it until she was already in the car." The eggs were done. I plated them, added some toast, and sat down at the table across from her. She watched me eat in silence for a few minutes, clearly recalibrating her approach. "Look, maybe I didn't phrase the text perfectly, but the point is we need to figure out if this is working." "Sure, but here's where your evaluation period gets interesting. You want to spend a week thinking about whether I'm worth keeping, which implies you have other options you're considering. So let's make sure you have all the data you need." I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot. "I called our insurance company this morning. You're still covered for the rest of this week, but I wanted to understand our policy's separation clauses. Turns out if we separate permanently, you'll need your own coverage. Current rate for someone your age with your medical history about $400 a month." Her eyes widened. "I also looked into the mortgage. If we divorce, the house gets sold unless one of us can qualify for refinancing the full amount solo. Based on your current income from the part-time marketing job, that's not happening. But don't worry, I ran the numbers on what your half of the equity would be after realtor fees and closing costs. Should be enough for a nice apartment deposit." "What are you doing?" "Giving you accurate information for your evaluation. You can't properly assess whether someone's worth keeping if you don't understand what you're actually keeping or losing." She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. This wasn't the script she'd written in her mind, where I'd spend the week proving myself worthy of her continued affection. "I also transferred half of our joint savings into a separate account. Seemed fair since you're not sure if you want to keep sharing finances with me. You can't just do that." "Actually, I can. It's legally my money too. But don't worry, if you decide I'm worth keeping, we can discuss combining resources again. If not, well, now you know exactly what your financial situation looks like." The color had drained from her face. She was beginning to understand that her ultimatum hadn't put her in the driver's seat like she'd imagined. It had simply given me permission to stop pretending her uncertainty about our marriage wasn't affecting my decision-making too. "This is crazy. I wasn't trying to threaten you." "Then what were you trying to do?" She opened her mouth, then closed it because the honest answer was that she was trying to create urgency, to make me fight for her attention the way I had when we were dating. She wanted to feel pursued, chosen, prioritized. But she'd miscalculated completely. I was trying to have an honest conversation about our relationship, No, you were trying to put me on probation. There's a difference. Honest conversations happen face to face with both people participating. Ultimatums get delivered by text. I finished my breakfast and rinsed my plate. I'm heading to work. Take all the time you need with your evaluation. Just remember that evaluations work both ways. While you're deciding if I'm worth keeping, I'm getting a pretty clear picture of what it's like to be married to someone who sees our relationship as conditional. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Wait, she called after me. What's that supposed to mean? I turned back to look at her sitting there with her laptop, her coffee, and her carefully calculated ultimatum that was backfiring spectacularly. It means that a man who knows his worth doesn't spend his time convincing other people to recognize it. He spends his time with people who already do. By Thursday evening, she was getting desperate. I could tell because she'd stopped with the subtle attempts at conversation and moved into what I recognized as test number 2. I walked into the house to find her in the kitchen with someone I'd never seen before, tall guy, probably mid-30s, wearing an expensive watch, and that overly confident smile men get when they think they're being clever. Hey, honey, she said, her voice artificially bright. This is Derek from my yoga class. I invited him for dinner since you've been so focused on work lately. The setup was obvious. She wanted to see if I'd get jealous, if I'd fight for her attention, if I'd finally crack and start acting like the insecure husband she expected. Derek extended his hand with a grin that suggested he knew exactly what game was being played. Nice to meet you, man. Your wife's been telling me so much about you. I shook his hand firmly and smiled back. All good things, I hope. Though given the week we're having, I'm not sure what story she's been sharing. His confidence flickered slightly. That wasn't the response he'd been coached to expect. She mentioned you work in sales. That's cool. I'm in real estate myself. Regional management, actually. Just got promoted. But real estate's interesting. Tough market right now with the interest rates. You must be working twice as hard to close deals. Yeah, well, you know how it is. Adapt or die, right? Absolutely. Speaking of adapting, I hope you don't mind that we're keeping dinner simple tonight. I've been handling most of the grocery shopping this week while my wife takes some time to evaluate our relationship. The room went completely silent. She shot me a look that could have melted steel, but I kept my expression pleasant and conversational. Derek glanced between us, clearly realizing he'd walked into something much more complicated than he'd signed up for. Oh, that's cool. Relationships take work, right? They do. Though I've learned that some people prefer to outsource that work to other people instead of doing it themselves. But hey, everyone has their approach. I opened the refrigerator and started pulling out ingredients. Hope you like pasta, Derek. It's about all we have since I'm not sure what our grocery budget looks like after this week. She was staring at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. This was supposed to be my moment to get territorial, to demand explanations, to prove that I cared enough to fight for her. Instead, I was treating her yoga buddy like a dinner guest and exposing her manipulation in real time. Actually, Derek said, checking his watch, I just remembered I have an early showing tomorrow. Maybe we should reschedule. Don't be silly, I said, filling a pot with water. You're already here. Besides, my wife clearly went to the trouble of planning this. Would hate for her effort to go to waste. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Whatever story she'd told him about our marriage apparently hadn't included the part where her husband would calmly discuss their relationship problems in front of strangers. So, Derek, I continued, setting the pot on the stove. How long have you been taking yoga? I've always thought about trying it myself, but I wasn't sure if beginners are welcome in established classes. About 6 months. And yeah, beginners are definitely welcome. Great to know. Maybe I'll join you both next week, assuming we're still doing couple activities after my wife finishes her evaluation period. She finally found her voice. Can I talk to you in the other room? Sure. Derek, make yourself comfortable. We'll just be a minute. I followed her into the living room, where she immediately spun around to face me. What the hell are you doing? Making dinner for your guest. Wasn't that the plan? You know exactly what I mean. Actually, I don't. You invited someone over for dinner. I'm being hospitable. Is there a problem? You're embarrassing me by being honest about our situation. I thought transparency was important to you. After all, you did say you needed time to evaluate whether I'm worth keeping. You can't just tell people that. Why not? It's the truth. Unless you've changed your mind about needing that evaluation period. She opened her mouth, then closed it because saying yes would mean admitting the whole thing was a manipulation tactic, and saying no would mean doubling down on the ultimatum that was already backfiring. This isn't how this was supposed to go. How what was supposed to go? Dinner with your yoga friend, or your attempt to make me jealous? Her face flushed red. I wasn't trying to make you jealous. And why didn't you mention having someone over until I walked in and found him here? Why the sudden interest in hosting when you've barely cooked a meal in the past month? Because you've been distant, and I thought maybe seeing me interact with other people would remind you what you're missing. There it was, the honest answer she hadn't meant to give. So you invited another man to our house to show me what I'm missing during the week you're supposedly evaluating whether I'm worth keeping. Do I have that right? She realized her mistake immediately. I didn't mean it like that. Derek seems like a nice guy, but he's about to realize he got recruited for someone else's relationship drama. That's not fair to him, and it's not fair to me. I headed back toward the kitchen. I'm going to finish making dinner like a good host. You can explain to your friend why his evening just got more complicated than he bargained for. When we returned to the kitchen, Derek was already gathering his things. You know what? I actually do need to prep for tomorrow's showing. Thanks for the invitation, though. You sure? I asked. The pasta's almost ready. Yeah, I'm sure. Nice meeting you, though. After he left, she turned to me with a look of pure frustration. Happy now? About what? Having an honest dinner conversation? Always. You humiliated me. No. I treated your guest with respect while being honest about our situation. If that felt humiliating, maybe you should think about why. I drained the pasta and started plating it. Besides, I thought you wanted to evaluate whether I'm worth keeping. How else are you supposed to do that without seeing how I handle situations like this? She stared at me for a long moment, probably realizing that every test she tried to run had backfired completely. Instead of making me desperate for her attention, she was discovering exactly what kind of man she'd been married to all along. You're not the same person I married. You're right. The person you married would have spent this week begging you to change your mind. This person knows better. Friday morning brought a different approach. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with what looked suspiciously like prepared talking points written on a notepad. Her whole demeanor had shifted from testing to damage control. I think we need to have a real conversation, she said as I poured my coffee. We've been having real conversations all week, unless you mean a conversation where I pretend your ultimatum didn't happen. Look, I'll admit I handled this wrong. The text, the whole thing. I was frustrated and I didn't express myself well. I sat down across from her, curious to see where this was heading. Go on. What I was really trying to say is that we've gotten into a rut. We don't talk like we used to. We don't do things together anymore. I felt like we were becoming roommates instead of spouses. Interesting theory. Tell me more about this rut. She consulted her notes. Well, like I said, you've been working more hours, and when you are home, you're usually on your laptop or watching those business podcasts. The promotion I got required additional training modules, 30 hours of coursework that I had to complete on my own time. I mentioned this to you several times. I know, but... And those business podcasts? I was researching investment strategies because I wanted to discuss moving our savings into higher yield accounts, something that would benefit both of us. She shifted uncomfortably. Okay, but what about the social stuff? You used to enjoy going out with friends. Your friends who spend every gathering complaining about their husbands, careers, their husbands' hobbies, their husbands' families. I got tired of being the only man in the room who wasn't being discussed like a disappointing employee. They don't do that. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a text thread. Last Friday at dinner with your book club. Quote, at least your husband actually listens when you talk. Mine just grunts and goes back to his video games. End quote. That was directed at you about me while I was sitting right there. Her face went pale. The Friday before that. You're so lucky he actually plans date nights. I have to literally schedule intimacy like a dentist appointment. Again about me in front of me like I was a piece of furniture. I didn't realize you heard that. I heard all of it. Every eye roll when I contributed to conversations. Every passive-aggressive comment about men in general that was clearly aimed at me specifically. Every time you'd laugh along instead of defending your husband. She looked down at her notepad, probably realizing her prepared talking points weren't going to work against documented evidence. But here's what's really interesting, I continued. All week, you've been testing me, the ultimatum, the yoga instructor, the attempts to make me chase after your attention. But not once have you asked what I've been thinking about during your evaluation period. What do you mean? You've been so focused on deciding whether I'm worth keeping that you never considered I might be making the same evaluation about you. The color drained from her face completely. Wednesday, I met with 3 divorce attorneys not because I'd made any decisions, but because I wanted to understand my options. Turns out documentation is important in these situations. I pulled out a folder from my briefcase and set it on the table, bank statements showing the individual accounts I opened, screenshots of her text messages including the original ultimatum, photos of the yoga instructor she'd invited over without warning, a timeline of her behavior patterns over the past 6 months. You can't be serious. Dead serious. You wanted to spend a week evaluating whether I'm worth keeping. I spent the same week evaluating whether I want to be kept by someone who sees our marriage as conditional. She stared at the folder like it might explode. This is insane. I was trying to save our marriage. You were trying to control it. There's a difference. Saving a marriage requires both people working together. What you did was issue an ultimatum and expect me to dance for your approval. I never said you had to prove anything. You literally said you needed time to think if I was worth keeping. What exactly did you think I was supposed to do with that information? Sit quietly while you decided my fate? She was quiet for a long moment, probably realizing how her actions looked when presented as evidence rather than emotions. What happens now? That depends on you. Your evaluation period ends tomorrow. But here's the thing you didn't consider when you started this process. The moment you told me you weren't sure if I was worth keeping, you showed me exactly how you see this relationship. I leaned back in my chair. A woman who values her husband doesn't put him on probation. She doesn't invite other men over to test his reactions. She doesn't threaten the stability of their marriage to get attention. I wasn't threatening anything. Then what were you doing? She opened her mouth, then closed it again because the honest answer was that she was absolutely making threats, and we both knew it. The lawyers all told me the same thing. Documentation matters, intent matters, pattern of behavior matters. And what I've documented this week is a pattern of manipulation, testing, and emotional games. Are you divorcing me? I'm prepared to. The papers are drawn up. All they need is my signature. Her hands were shaking now. Over one text message? Over 6 years of marriage where my wife apparently sees me as someone who needs to prove his worth rather than someone whose worth she already recognizes? I stood up and refilled my coffee. You wanted a week to decide if I'm worth keeping. Tomorrow's your deadline. But understand this, whatever decision you make, I've already made mine about what it means to be married to someone who thinks ultimatums are appropriate relationship tools. What does that mean? It means that even if you decide I'm worth keeping, I'm not sure you're worth keeping me. Saturday morning, I was enjoying my coffee and reading when the doorbell rang. Through the window I could see her mother's car in the driveway. The cavalry had arrived. I opened the door to find not just her mother, but her sister and her best friend from college. All 3 women looked like they were prepared for battle. We need to talk, her mother announced, pushing past me into the house. Good morning to you too. Please come in. They assembled in the living room like a tribunal. My wife emerged from upstairs, clearly having orchestrated this ambush. We're here because someone needs to talk sense into you, her sister started. She's been crying all week. I'm sorry to hear that. Ultimatums can be emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Her mother stepped forward. Don't get smart with me, young man. Marriage requires compromise. You can't just threaten divorce every time you have a disagreement. Interesting perspective. Tell me, when your daughter sent me a text saying she needed a week to decide if I was worth keeping, was that compromise? She was expressing her feelings through an ultimatum. But somehow I'm the one threatening divorce. Her best friend chimed in. Look, I know her. She doesn't mean half the things she says when she's upset. You should know that by now. So I should have ignored her when she said she was evaluating whether to keep me, just dismissed it as emotional noise? You should have fought for your marriage instead of giving up at the first sign of trouble. I set down my coffee and looked at each of them in turn. Let me ask you something. If your husband sent you a text saying he needed a week to decide if you were worth keeping, how would you respond? Her mother's face tightened. That's different. How? Because men don't. They wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Wouldn't evaluate their wives like business investments? Wouldn't invite other women over during the evaluation period? Wouldn't put their spouses on probation? The room went quiet. Her sister glanced at my wife. probably realizing there were details to this story she hadn't heard. "What other women?" her mother demanded. My wife's face went red. It wasn't like that. "She invited a man from her yoga class over for dinner Thursday night. Didn't mention it until I walked in and found him here. When I asked her about it privately, she admitted she wanted me to see her interacting with other people to remind me what I was missing." Her best friend's mouth dropped open. "You did what?" "It wasn't a date. It was just dinner. During the week you were evaluating whether to keep your husband with a man I'd never met, without any advance notice." I looked at her support crew. "Would any of you have done that to your spouses?" Her sister was staring at my wife like she'd grown horns. "That's incredibly inappropriate." "Which brings us to why you're all here," I continued. "You came to convince me to fight for my marriage. But none of you have asked what I'm fighting for." Her mother crossed her arms. "You're fighting for your wife, for your family." "Am I?" "Because this week my wife has treated our marriage like a probationary period. She's tested my reactions by bringing other men into our home. She's issued ultimatums by text message instead of having adult conversations. She's recruited her family to pressure me instead of addressing the issues directly." I gestured toward my wife. "So tell me, what exactly am I supposed to be fighting to keep?" "A woman who loves you," her mother said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "A woman who loves me doesn't put me on trial. She doesn't test me with other men. She doesn't threaten the stability of our marriage to get my attention." Her best friend was looking uncomfortable now. "Maybe there's fault on both sides here." "Absolutely. I should have addressed these patterns months ago instead of hoping they'd resolve themselves. I should have set clearer boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept. I should have recognized that someone who sees love as conditional probably isn't ready for marriage." My wife finally spoke up. "That's not fair. I do love you. You love the idea of me. You love what I provide, what I represent, how I make you feel, but you don't love me enough to treat me with basic respect." "That's not true." "Then explain the ultimatum. Explain why you thought it was appropriate to give your husband a deadline to prove his worth. Explain why you invited another man over during that evaluation period." She looked around the room for support, but her reinforcements were starting to see the situation differently. Her sister spoke first. "I think maybe we should go. This seems like something you two need to work out privately." "Actually," I said, "since you're all here, there's something you should know. Your intervention is unnecessary. Today is the last day of the evaluation period she requested. Tomorrow she'll give me her decision about whether I'm worth keeping." I stood up and walked to my briefcase. "But I've already made my decision about whether I want to be married to someone who thinks ultimatums are appropriate relationship tools." I pulled out the divorce papers and set them on the coffee table. All four women stared at them like they were radioactive. "These are divorce papers. They're complete, except for my signature. Whether I sign them depends entirely on what happens in the next 24 hours. Her mother's face had gone pale. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. Your daughter wanted a week to evaluate my worth. Well, I used the same week to evaluate what it means to be married to someone who sees our relationship as conditional." I looked directly at my wife. "You have until tomorrow evening to decide if I'm worth keeping. But understand this, even if you decide I am, I'm not sure you've proven that you're worth keeping me." The room was dead silent. Her support team had come here expecting to shame me into submission, to convince me that fighting for scraps of affection was noble. Instead, they were witnessing what it looks like when a man refuses to beg for basic respect. "I think you should all leave now. She has some serious thinking to do, and she needs to do it without a cheering section telling her that ultimatums are just expressing feelings." As they filed out, her mother turned back to me. "Marriage is supposed to be forever. You're absolutely right. That's exactly why it shouldn't be treated like a probationary period." Sunday evening arrived with the weight of finality. I'd spent the day doing exactly what I'd been doing all week, living my life with dignity and purpose. I went for a run, caught up on some reading, and prepared a simple dinner. No dramatic gestures, no last-minute attempts to influence her decision. A man who knows his worth doesn't campaign for recognition. She'd been unusually quiet all day, moving around the house like she was walking through a museum of her former life. Every few hours I'd catch her looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not the calculating look from early in the week, but something closer to panic. At exactly 7 o'clock, she appeared in the living room where I was reading. She'd clearly prepared for this moment, probably rehearsed her speech multiple times. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I closed my book and gave her my full attention. I'm listening. I want to keep you. I want to keep us. She took a shaky breath. I realize now that I handled everything wrong this week, the text, the ultimatum, bringing Derek over. I was scared we were drifting apart, and I thought maybe if I created some urgency it would remind you how much we mean to each other. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I know it was manipulative. I know it was unfair, but I was desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. I nodded slowly. Go on. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about how I see our relationship as conditional. You're right. I have been treating our marriage like something you had to earn instead of something we both chose. Her voice cracked. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. If you'll give me another chance, I promise I'll do better. I'll communicate instead of testing. I'll trust instead of manipulating. I'll treat you like the husband you've always been, instead of like someone who has to prove himself. When she finished, the room fell silent. She sat there looking at me with hope and fear battling in her eyes, waiting for my response to her decision that I was worth keeping. I reached over to the coffee table and picked up the divorce papers that had been sitting there since yesterday. Her breath caught as I opened the folder. I appreciate your honesty, I said finally, and I believe you mean everything you just said. But here's what you still don't understand. I pulled out a pen and held it over the signature line. The moment you sent me that text asking for a week to evaluate my worth, our marriage changed forever, not because of what you decided, but because of what you revealed about how you see me. Her face went white. Please don't sign those. For 6 years, I thought I was married to someone who chose me, someone who saw my value and decided she wanted to build a life with me. This week, I discovered I was actually married to someone who sees me as a commodity she needs to periodically reevaluate. That's not true anymore. I told you I realized I was wrong. You realize you were wrong because the consequences became real. But what happens the next time you feel insecure? The next time we go through a rough patch? Do I get another evaluation period? Another ultimatum? She was crying now, but I continued. You wanted a week to decide if I was worth keeping. Well, I used that same week to decide if I want to be kept by someone who thinks that's an appropriate way to handle marriage. I signed the papers with steady hands. And I decided I don't. You can't do this. We can fix this. No, we can't. Because the fundamental problem isn't something that can be fixed with promises. You don't see me as an equal partner. You see me as someone whose position in your life needs periodic review. I stood up and handed her the signed papers. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt anymore. I'm just done being married to someone who treats love like a performance evaluation. She clutched the papers but didn't look at them. What about everything we built together? 6 years of marriage, our home, our plans. Those things were built on the assumption that we both valued each other unconditionally. You've proven that assumption was wrong, at least on your end. I can change. I will change. Maybe you will, but not with me. I'm not interested in being someone's learning experience or redemption project. I'm interested in being with someone who already knows my worth without needing a week to think about it. I walked toward the stairs, then turned back to look at her one final time. She was sitting there holding the divorce papers, tears streaming down her face, probably realizing that her evaluation period had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. For what it's worth, I said, I hope you do learn from this. I hope your next relationship is with someone you never feel the need to test, evaluate, or put on probation, because that's what real love looks like. It looks like choosing someone and then never questioning that choice. What am I supposed to do now? Whatever you want. You're free to find someone whose worth you don't need time to consider. Someone who meets whatever standards you're still figuring out. Someone who doesn't mind being evaluated. I headed upstairs to pack a bag. I'd be staying at a hotel while we worked out the details. But the hard part was over. I'd chosen my own worth over someone else's uncertainty about it. Behind me, I could hear her sobbing, probably realizing that her week of evaluation had cost her everything she'd been trying to save. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd given her exactly what she'd asked for, complete honesty about what life looked like without me. The difference was she'd thought she was the one making the choice. She never considered that ultimatums work both ways, and that a man who knows his value doesn't wait around for other people to recognize it. He finds someone who already does. As I packed my clothes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally stopping the exhausting work of trying to prove yourself to someone who should already know your worth. She'd gotten her week to think. and I'd gotten my freedom.